Okay, so tonight's lesson is going to be the car section, applying answer choices to passages. And my name is Chris. I am one of the tutors here. So just a quick introduction and some useful links. Like I said, my name's Chris. I graduated from Stony Brook University with a BS in Applied Mathematics and Statistics, actually in 2019. I was working for the last 2 years, and in April, I took the MCAT and I got a 520 on it. So if you ever have any questions, you want any advice, anything like that, you can always reach out to me. I put my email here, and then I just put some other contact information for the group as well. So we have the GroupMe link over there. You can share that, use that. And the Instagram handle is @SocraticMed_ there too. And obviously this PowerPoint is going to be uploaded to the Google Drive afterwards, so you can always come back to it. So just to kick it off, I figured we could go over some advice, some tips for how to tackle the car section, specifically how to look at the passage and the answers. So just some general knowledge, you're going to have 90 minutes to read 9 passages and answer 53 questions. So it's really important that you keep your pace and you keep your attention focused, but you don't rush. So, I mean, I know we've all been in the situation where we're reading passages and you'll spend 2 minutes reading and then you just realize at one point, what did I just read? The trick is to not do that. You have to read and really focus your attention on what you're reading and process the information, because if you don't process the information of the sentence that you're reading, you're not going to understand the sentence after that or after that, and then you just wasted 2 minutes reading a passage that you don't understand. So I think a really big key is to be aware of your attention and to be aware of how you're focusing it when you're reading. So you can glance at the questions to get an idea of what it's asking before you read the passage, but really don't waste any time. So at this point, we've all taken a lot of standardized tests and we all know how well we can read and how well we can, understand and process information. If you're a fast reader and you like reading with an objective, then it might be a good idea to take maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds to glance at the questions first so that you're reading with an objective. If not, I would recommend just diving right into the passage. That's what I did. I scored a 129 on it. I don't like to look at the questions beforehand because I think it's wasting my time. But like I said, you know how you learn the best. And another suggestion that I have is to use the highlight feature, but use it wisely. Because if you don't use it wisely, it can be very time consuming, and it can waste some of your time. I apologize if you hear a dog whining in the background. That's my dog. So the things to highlight, try not to go crazy with it because, again, it's going to be wasting your time. But you can look for tone, look for mood, look for any main ideas of the passage, and look for any points of view. These are some pretty good jumping points when you want to look back and you're trying to find the content in the passage. Because a lot of the questions will also be inference questions. So these sorts of things are very good to keep an eye out for. So dealing with answer choices. So tips on dealing with tricky answer choices: beware of attractors, aka distractors. I'm sure you've heard of both names. You have to keep in mind that the people that write the MCAT are masters. They're masters at writing questions and they're masters at writing tricky answers. And they're going to put those tricky answers in there to distract you. So I just listed here some of these attractors that you might see. These are not all of them, but these make up a good amount of the questions that you might see, the answer choices that you might see, rather. So the first one that I wanted to discuss was the half right, half wrong. So if any part of the statement is wrong, the answer choice is incorrect. That's pretty self-explanatory, but sometimes in practice, it's not as easy as you think. You have to, again, focus your attention on the question and make sure that every part of the question, if it's an and statement or an or statement, you have to make sure that the whole statement is true and that it fits the question. Opposites. The content may seem correct, but a negation is added or removed, like not or on. Again, it's just going to require you paying close attention to what you're reading. Sometimes it's tricky. Sometimes if you're not paying attention and you're trying to speed read and rushing through the section, you're not going to notice these kinds of questions. You're not going to notice these kinds of modifiers like the not on, any sort of negation that might be in there. So you have to really pay attention for those things and make sure you understand what you're reading and make sure that you're answering the question. Language tricks as well. A choice may have overly complex language, use absolutes, use superlatives, use them incorrectly to try to confuse you. So you may come across a question and you're reading down the answers, and one of the answers you read is just so complex, you read it 2 or 3 times and you're just thinking to yourself, what does this mean? That's the point of the question. That's the point of the answer. They're writing that to confuse you and to draw your attention. They hope that you read that question, that answer, have no idea what it means, and then choose it. So you really have to pay attention to that. Make sure you read all of the answer choices before you make your choice. And just try not to get bogged down by the language, because there will always be a right answer that makes sense. So again, you just have to review the questions. And then once you find that question that sort of makes sense, you can rule out that, tricky language answer choice. So correct information, incorrect question is another one that's super difficult, because the statement is going to be true, but it's not necessarily answering the question. And if it's not answering the question, it's not the correct answer. So you may come across an answer choice where you're reading it and it sounds right to you, but there's that little voice that's telling you it's not answering the question. So you should listen to that little voice and review the other questions, because you're going to find a better answer. It just comes down to the bottom line that if it's not answering the question, it's not the correct answer. And another one is outside knowledge. So most of these passages are going to be humanities and social sciences. And a lot of the times the passages will touch upon information that you learned in your pre-med requisites. And the MCAT question creators are depending on this, because one of the distractors is outside knowledge. So this section is not testing your general knowledge. While the background information may be helpful, all of your answer choices have to be supported by the passage. So if it's talking about history, or if it's talking about some sort of social science, like a psychological experiment, you can use the general background knowledge that you have of the subject to help you answer the questions. But the bottom line is that if your answer is not supported by explicit information that comes from the passage, it's not correct. So really keep that in mind. All of your answers are going to be based in the passage. And that's the good part of the cars section, is that all of the answers really are there. Right. And as Mark said, the tips apply to the passage-based questions on the other sections of the MCAT more or less. So keep them in mind during the other sections as well. These are really good strategies to use for all of the sections, because, obviously the other sections also have reading comprehension as well. Okay. So just a couple of more tips. Manage your time wisely. Practice makes perfect. You're not going to be able to manage your time and build stamina unless you're doing these practice questions. So to start, you can look at the passages individually without a time constraint, and carefully review the passages in questions. If you have a lot of time, like multiple months before your MCAT, you can definitely do this, just to sort of be familiar with the wording of the questions that they use, and just be familiar with what kind of passages you're going to see. Once you feel that you have a solid strategy down, though, you really need to add the time constraint and work on your pacing, because the pacing is the super important part. And it's going to be pretty much is going to be the deciding factor, at least for me, of how well you do in the cars section. You should really get those time constraints to be practicing a full-length time car section, I would say at least a few months before your MCAT, because you really want to be prepared for this. Practice makes perfect with this section, as with everything else. So you really just want to be prepared when you go in for test day. And the best way to do that is just to be doing these practice questions in an environment that's as similar to the test as possible. Okay, so we're going to go on to the 3 types of questions that the AAMC lists that you will find in the cars section. So how I want to do this is we're going to use this first review passage, and then we're going to review the questions and how they're related to this passage. I just sent another link. You might be able to access that one. Opal, I haven't given the questions yet. We're just going to read it, and then we're going to go through individual questions, like per the AAMC breakdown. So just read, familiarize yourself with the passage, and then we're going to go through the questions together first. All right, we're going to give you about another minute, and then we're going to go on to the questions. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move to the next screen and we're going to just discuss some of the questions. Okay, so the 3 types of cars questions according to the AAMC. This was from the website. So we're just going to go over one at a time and then look at an example and how it applies to the passage that we just read. So foundations of comprehension is the first type of question that you may see. It makes up about 30% of the questions that you're going to find in the cars section. And these are questions that test your ability to identify central themes, points of view, contextual vocabulary, and the overall message of the passage. So these are the questions, they're reading comprehension. You're going to find the answer explicitly in the text. You may have to paraphrase, but they're going to be in the text. So this is just a quick example of a question. It doesn't really have a passage applied passage to it or the answers. I just wanted to show you guys the structure of it. So it would say something like, according to the passage, the author believes that Freud's work is most useful when used as, and then you have A, B, C, or D. You would be able to find this answer in the passage. There would most likely be a paragraph that explains how the author believes Freud's work is most usefully used. Does that make sense to everyone? It's pretty much just reading comprehension that you're taking from the passage. It's not too inference based. Okay. Okay, cool. Makes sense. So question 1, foundations of comprehension. So this is a question that is going to relate to the passage that we just read. So keep that out. Opal, you said, so is that not rereading passage, which will take up time? So I recommend reading the whole passage once like we just did. And then when you're going through the questions, you're going to have to go back to the passage. So if you look at this question, it says in paragraph 3, the author uses an analogy in order to. I would definitely recommend going back and rereading paragraph 3. So I just put it down here so we can read that together. He says, and yet surely he who knows the superior ought to know the inferior also. He who can judge of the good speaker is able to judge of the bad, and poetry is a whole. And he who judges of poetry by rules of art ought to be able to judge all of poetry. This is confirmed by the analogy of sculpture, painting, flute playing, and other arts. The argument is that at last brought home to the mind of Ion, who asks how this contradiction is to be solved. So like I said, it's a good idea to reread that passage. I put that there for your reference. So question 1, in paragraph 3, the author uses an analogy in order to. So I'm going to open a poll and let you guys figure this out amongst yourselves. So take a minute and let me know what you think. Like 30 more seconds and we'll go over it. Okay, get your answers in. We're going to end. All right. So the majority of you said B. 50% of you, 8% said A, and 42% said D. So the majority of you did not get it right, but 46% of you did, and we're definitely going to go over it. And it's a good thing that you guys did get it right because it's a learning opportunity. So let's go through them. So the question states in paragraph 3, the author uses an analogy in order to. So first you have to identify where the analogy is in paragraph 3. And fortunately in this paragraph, he says this is confirmed by the analogy of sculpture, painting, flute playing, and the other arts. The argument is at last brought home to the mind of Ion, who asks how this contradiction is to be solved. So A, reinforce Homer's status as the preeminent poet. We get a feel throughout the passage that Ion does believe Homer is the preeminent poet, but this specific analogy is not proving that. It doesn't really say anything about Homer being preeminent. It doesn't say anything about him being better than other poets. It's not comparing Homer to the other poets. It's comparing different art forms to each other. So A can't be correct just for that reason, pretty much. B, dispel the notion that Ion is a bad judge. A lot of you did pick this one. I'm kind of curious for the thought process. Does anybody want to sort of type what their thought process was? You don't have to if you don't want to, just a thought. Because it's not really dispelling the notion that Ion is a bad judge. Again, it's just really comparing the different media, the different sort of arts. And C, suggesting that Hesiod's work is misunderstood. Hesiod's mentioned once in the text, I think in like paragraph 1 or 2, and it's just to mention that Ion thinks that Hesiod's work is not up to par with Homer's. Again, the analogy specifically does not really have anything to do with Hesiod, so none of you really said C, so that's good. Again, these are comprehension questions, so when you can identify that it's a comprehension question, it's going to be exactly what is in there. So D, present a dispute that will be resolved. The last sentence of this paragraph says, the argument is at last brought home to the mind of Ion, who asks how this contraindication is to be solved. So the key point is asks how this contradiction is to be solved. They are posing a problem and a hypothetical solution. So that should be a pretty good indicator that D is going to be the correct answer because they're presenting a dispute that will most likely be resolved. And if you actually look at the first sentence of paragraph 4, it says the solution given by Socrates is as follows. And then the rest of the paragraph offers a solution to that analogy. So that's why D is correct. Does anybody have any questions about that? Oh, but why is A incorrect again? To reinforce Homer's status as the preeminent poet, because it's asking specifically, at least to my understanding, it's asking specifically about what the analogy serves, what is the analogy's purpose, and it's comparing the different art forms. It's not comparing Homer's status to other poets. So it's not explicitly saying Homer is better than Hesiod or Homer is better than Archilochus. It's just comparing the different art forms. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I did choose D, and the reason why I did, not necessarily because I understood the quote, but one of the techniques you mentioned about if eliminating correct info. If 2 answer choices seems the same, then we could probably get like B and C seem like there's a bad judge, something is misunderstood. So that's kind of similar to me. So I know A and D was more of a. So that's how I did it, not necessarily understand the quote. Is that okay also?
Yeah, that's definitely a good thought process. If you see that 2 answers are sort of giving the same answer, there's a very good choice that they won't be correct. And on the same note, if you see that 2 choices are giving completely contradicting answers, then that should also be a red flag that one of them is probably correct if there are two answers that are given completely different ones.
Right. So how do you distinguish whether you see how A says it's a reinforcement versus a presentation? So the verbs are tripping me up, like
Mhm.
it's more forceful versus the other one is more blah. And I was told that the car section is not really a definitive, it's more of a
Yep.
it's not a strict kind of thing. So you might want to choose an answer that's not as definitive.
Exactly. You kind of want to stay away from choosing answers that are extreme, like superlatives, like we talked about before, because these passages are usually going to be humanities and social sciences. And as I'm sure you know, humanities and social sciences, there's a lot of gray areas. There are not a lot of extreme cases in them, and that really does translate when you do the car section. So for foundations of comprehension, it's basically you're just looking at the text. D, it's presenting a dispute that will be resolved just because that last sentence is pretty much the only the concrete evidence that we can get from that passage, and it supports D. Okay. All right, everyone's good with that? Then we will move on to our second type of questions according to the AMC. So the second one is reasoning within the text. And this also makes up about 30% of the questions that you're going to see on the car section. And these questions are going to test your ability to infer the author's beliefs, assumptions, and biases. So example, using tone and mood to infer a thesis when it's not explicitly stated in the passage. So these, we're sort of taking the reading comprehension to the next step. We have to use what we see in the passage and infer what the author is saying in the passage. So an example of that would be based on the information in the paragraph, the author would most strongly agree with which of these statements. So this question is basically asking, what are they saying? I'm rephrasing what four choices of what the author is possibly saying. Which one of these is he actually saying? So this is the next question. I'm going to put up a poll again. I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to think about it. Just keep in mind, it's not reading comprehension. This is more of an inference question. So do with that what you will. I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll go over it in a couple. Okay, take about another 10 seconds, get your final answers in, and we will discuss. Okay. So it looks like 45% of you said A, 9% of you said B, 36% said C, and 9% said D. Well, the good news is 45% of you got it right. And let's go over it. So, according to the passage, the author is most likely to agree with which of the following statements? So, A, the correct answer, Ion can distinguish a good speaker from a bad speaker. We'll come back to that. We're just going to review B, C, and D and why they're incorrect first. So Ion believes that Hesiod and Archilochus have potential to be great poets, but they have not yet maximized that potential. We sort of touched upon this, or I touched upon this when I was discussing the last question as well. Hesiod and Archilochus are really only mentioned once in the passage. It's actually in the second. And that he knows nothing of inferior poets such as Hesiod and Archilochus. They're not mentioned any time after that. So the only really information that we can infer from the passage about these two poets is that Ion doesn't think they're great poets, especially when compared to Homer. He says nothing about their potential, and he says nothing about the possibility of him appreciating their works more if they were to change. So there's really no information in the passage that supports B. C, Socrates believes he is a better rhapsode than Ion. That's not correct. Socrates really, in this passage, serves as more of a philosopher, and he gives an answer to a question that's posed. He doesn't really play a role as a rhapsode. So it doesn't really say anywhere in the passage that he believes he's better than Ion. He just poses a solution as to why Ion really only appreciates Homer's work. So that's why C is also incorrect. Ion can only speak when Homer is physically present. Not a lot of you picked that for good reason. That's one of those things when you read it, I really just don't have an explanation for that other than there's just nothing in the passage that can support that. There's nothing in the passage that would lead you to infer that he can only speak when Homer is physically present, because he appreciates all of Homer's work, and he appreciates the poetry of Homer. So you can infer that he would also appreciate it if it were coming from someone else. But again, there's nothing that says Homer needs to be physically present for Ion to speak. Which brings us back to A, which is the correct answer. Ion can distinguish a good speaker from a bad speaker. So if we go back to paragraph 3, the first sentence says, "And yet surely he who knows the superior ought to know the inferior also." So the author included that quote in there because he's basically saying, if you know the superior, then just inherently you know the inferior from that. And Ion knows that Homer is superior, so the author believes that Ion can distinguish a good speaker from a bad speaker. So he specifically includes that statement in there to let you know that that's what he believes. Does anybody have any questions about that? I know this one was a little more difficult. You can unmute or write in the chat.
Oh, I have a question.
Sure.
Turn this down.
Yeah.
So could a part of C, wait, no, nothing. Part of B be that half truth that you were talking about, or is all of B an untruth?
No, that is definitely a half truth, because
It's a what? A half or
you can sort of consider it a half truth, because if you read it but they have not yet maximized that potential, that would lead you to believe that the author or Ion believes that they are not superior poets, that they are inferior poets. So you could definitely consider that to be a half truth. Yes. The problem is we don't see anywhere in the passage that these two poets have the potential to be great poets. Nothing is leading us to believe that Ion believes that. So that's how we know that he is not correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions before we move on?
Hey, yeah, for this passage, did you have any prior knowledge of Greek mythology before, or is this kind of, because I
Personally,
guess there's a lot of terminology that I'm personally am not familiar with. And
Yeah.
so I think that's what makes this passage exceptionally difficult to I guess distinguish what is what.
Yep. I personally, no, I did not have too much knowledge of Greek poetry or Greek history, but they do that on purpose. They're gonna try to use passages that use complex vocabulary, and they're gonna play around with the syntax and sort of make it hard to comprehend. You just have to, like I said, focus your attention, do your best, and you just have to use context clues to figure out the meaning of words that you don't understand, and then you just have to apply them to the question as best as you possibly can. And yeah, don't worry about the words you don't know too much. It depends on how key the word is to the passage, but a lot of times, you don't really have a choice. If you don't know what the word is, you kind of just have to continue on, read the rest of the passage, and sort of infer what it means based on the context.
Yeah, because there was this word rap something, and I didn't know what it was, and it just kept appearing within like the passage. So I was just kind of curious, like, what do you do like in that sense? Because there was a lot of big words in there that I guess like, how would you be able to use context clues to know what they mean?
Right. So you're talking about the word rhapsode, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, rhapsode, and then there was another one that was pretty big.
Right.
There was a
So,
lot
I
of.
mean, you just have to read and understand what the passage is talking about. So we know this passage is talking about poetry, it's talking about drama. So you can sort of infer that this is going to be some sort of artistic term. It's probably a person. Even if you don't know specifically what the person does, it's a safe guess to assume that this is some sort of artist. And again, when you do more practice passages, this sort of stuff is going to become more intuitive to you. That's why it's so important that you do these practice passages. Okay.
You just told Keith that my question has to do with, he asked about having prior knowledge of Greek mythology. So any truth to people telling you that you need to read all like New York Times and all these other literature sources that I really don't, do we need to learn?
Yeah, I would definitely advise that you do that because it helps you learn how to read these passages, and it'll help you learn how to analyze them. If you don't have a lot of experience doing that, it's super important that you build that experience because you don't want to be blindsided when you go in on test day. So any sort of reading and any sort of comprehension, any sort of analytical activity that you can do, like reading scientific literature, reading anything like that, and analyzing and understanding what the passage is talking about, it'll definitely help you on the car section. Yeah. So I would definitely recommend that you learn how to read scientific literature.
How long do you recommend that? Because that for me is not going to be overnight, and definitely not in like a month or so. So how long would you, I guess, to be able to naturally read this passage like it's just a regular book? Because I wasn't reading it like that. Like it just, I'm pretty sure when you were reading it, you probably thought, oh, well, this is like pretty simple to go through. Like, oh, I got to figure this out. But like to get to that kind of level where you're like, okay, like, I don't know what this really is, but I can figure it out, if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, and it's going to take a different amount of time for everybody. It's not going to be simple. No matter how much you do practice, it's not going to be simple because you have to be actively thinking about what you're reading. So you have to read sentence by sentence, and you should be checking in with yourself and making sure that you know exactly what you read. So, I mean, it's difficult, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen at your own pace, and you just have to figure out your own pace, and you have to make sure that you time it correctly to when you take your exam. Right. And like Janelle said, they don't expect students to have prior knowledge about the topic, but you really need to build your reading skills in complex articles. That's why it's critical analysis and reasoning, because you're not expected to have prior knowledge to it. It's really what you do with the knowledge that they give you, what you do with the data that they give you. Okay, so we're going to move on, just for time's sake, to our third question type. So this is reasoning beyond the text, and it makes up about 40% of the car section, so a little bit more than the other two. But of course, each test is random and each test is different. But these questions are the ones that offer new information, and they test your ability to understand how it affects the passage or how the passage will affect the new information. So this example, which of the following statements, if true, would most likely weaken the author's argument about Freud? In one full-length practice test, you will definitely see a couple of questions that are formatted like this. Which of the following statements, if true, would most likely weaken or would most likely strengthen the author's argument? You'll definitely see a couple like this. So it's important to understand that this is reasoning beyond the text. They're asking you a question, they are giving you 4 new statements, and they're asking you, what does the author think of this? How does this change the author's argument? Does it change the author's argument at all? So this is the third question that we're going to relate back to that Greek passage. So suppose a rhapsode screams, cries, and jumps during a performance. According to the passage, Socrates is most likely to think that the ABCD. So take a minute. I'm going to open the polls, and we will regroup in a few minutes and discuss. Okay, get your final answers in. And we will end. So that is interesting. Okay. So 23% A, 46% said B, 31% said C, and nobody said D. So the actual answer is C. And I really like this question, so I'm very glad that we're going over it. Okay, so let's start with A. The performer is treating the piece properly. Most of you did not pick that answer, rightfully so. Just because according to the passage, Socrates is most likely to think, A, the performer is treating the piece properly. Again, really the best answer that I can give to justify why it's not correct is that it doesn't really say anywhere in the passage that the performer is treating the piece properly. If anybody has any confusion with that, you can definitely let me know and I'll explain to you, but it's just not really supported by the passage and we're not really taking anything from that. The answer choice that I really want to talk about.
Wait, but can we go back to A? It does, sorry. It does say something about it being idiotic. So
which paragraph are you looking at, Opal?
Never mind, sorry.
You sure?
Yeah, idiotic means crazy, because never mind.
Okay, and we're gonna talk about that.
Yeah, I was thinking it did
specifically.
support, but it does not. You're right. Never mind.
Okay. Okay, so B, the performance is inspired. So this is definitely the distractor, and it's a very good distractor because if you're not reading the question carefully, you're not going to be able to pick the information out correctly from the passage. So you have to read very carefully. It says, according to the passage, Socrates is most likely to think that the. So we are looking for Socrates' point of view. If you go back to the passage and you look, I believe it is paragraph 5, that first sentence says, Ion is delighted at the notion of being inspired and acknowledges that he is beside himself when he is performing. His eyes rain tears and his hair stands on end. So if this question said, according to the passage, Ion is most likely to think that the, answer B would 100% be correct. But if we move over to the next sentence, we see Socrates is of opinion, in contrast to the previous sentence, Socrates is of opinion that a man must be mad who behaves in this way at a festival when he is surrounded by his friends and there is nothing to trouble him. So this gives us a different picture of what Socrates thinks. Both of these men are looking at the same performance, but they're thinking two different things. So Socrates thinks that if a man does this, he's mad. And you have to know that mad is a synonym for crazy. And that's how we come to the performer being crazy, because it's asking for Socrates' point of view. And D, the performance is uninteresting. Doesn't really say anything about Socrates' interest level. He might think the person's crazy, but I would think at least he would think the performance is interesting, which would be my reasoning for why D isn't correct. But does everyone understand why B is not correct now and why C is correct? Because we're looking specifically at what Socrates is thinking. Awesome. Yes, yes, yes. You guys are great. Okay. So Kevin asked, what connections or words helped you link this question to paragraph 5? It's a little bit, you have to kind of dig into the passage when they're not giving you a specific place to look at. And that's where your highlighting can help you. When you're highlighting mood, tone, that sort of sentence, Socrates is of opinion that a man must be mad who behaves in this way, is a pretty jarring statement, I would say. So I probably would have had that highlighted from the get-go. And whenever I don't know where to start, I usually skim all of my highlighted to see if there's some sort of tag that I can attach to that will lead me in the right direction. So that's how I would come to locate it. Otherwise, I would just scan the passage really quickly and look for words that are familiar. So I would look for anything that is close to inspired, anything that's close to crazy, anything that's close to uninteresting. And generally, you can come to the part of the passage pretty quickly by doing that. It's trial and error, but that's really the best way to do it, I would say. Yep. Great. Okay. So before we start the second and final passage, does anybody have any other questions about that last one?
Yeah, can I just go back to the answer?
Yeah.
You see how the question, the answer choices has performer, performer in 2, and then performance. So
Yeah.
I kind of looked and say, the question is asking, I think back when you told us about those rules to make sure that it's answering the question.
Mm-hmm.
By that rule, and the question is asking about Rhapsody, I imagine he's a performer. So even though I did narrow it to A and C, because it's not asking about the performance, so that's how I got rid of B and D. How is it that I get to 50% and then I choose the A? I will narrow it to the 50 and still choose the wrong one.
I don't know. How is it that you chose A? What led you
and
to?
I'm using your rules. You gave us the rules and said, if
Right.
The original, you said, make sure it is answering the question. And the question is asking about Rhapsody. So he's a performer. So, okay, we're down to A and C. So what passage I read something about somebody being idiotic. Oh, there. Okay, idiotic is the same as crazy. Okay.
Yeah, he says idiotic and he says mad.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I should have read that. Idiotic is crazy. Never mind. Got it.
No problem. That's what we're here for. We talk things out and we learn. Okay, so let me get you guys a working link for this as well. I'm going to give you about 7 minutes for this, and then we're not going to identify the questions for this one like we were last time. We're just going to go through some practice questions with it as if it were the same day. So give me one moment. You can start reading there now if you want, and I'm going to show you the link as well. Okay, so that should be the link.
Recording.
All right, take another minute or so to finish up, and then we're going to dive right into the questions. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start the first question. If you're having a little bit trouble with the timing with reading, don't worry. You know, you're going to get there. You just have to do some practice. These are very dense passages, and they're written that way on purpose. So, question 1. According to the first paragraph of the passage, the author implies that. So I'm going to put out a poll. I'll give you guys about a minute and 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and we'll regroup and discuss after. So there you go. All right, I'll give you guys 5 more seconds. Get your final answers in. Okay. So 31% of you said A, 23% of you said B, nobody said C, and 46% of you said D. So the correct answer, oh, and I forgot to put that up, but we will use that to go over it. The correct answer is B, believe it or not. The people in the country of discussion have a chance to enjoy finer aspects of life. So we will go over that right now. So let's first take a look at A, ignorance and mistake are unavoidable. So according to the first paragraph of the passage, the author implies that. So let's just reread the passage really quickly. Most men, even in this comparatively free country, through mere ignorance and mistake, are so occupied with the factitious cares and superfluously coarse labors of life that its finer fruits cannot be plucked by them. Their fingers from excessive toil are too clumsy and tremble too much for that. He has no time to be anything but a machine. How can he remember well his ignorance, which his growth requires, who has so often to use his knowledge? We should feed and clothe him gratuitously sometimes and recruit him with our cordials before we judge him. The finest qualities of our nature, like the bloom on fruits, can be preserved only by the most delicate handling. Yet we do not treat ourselves nor one another thus tenderly. So A says ignorance and mistake are unavoidable. If you look at that first sentence of the first paragraph, most men, even in this comparatively free country, through mere ignorance and mistake, are so occupied with factitious cares. He's saying that they're not enjoying the finer fruits of life because of their ignorance and their mistakes. So he's pretty much saying that this is the choice that they're making, and that because they're making the choice, because of their ignorance and because of their mistakes, they're not able to enjoy the finer fruits of life. So he's not saying that it's unavoidable. He's just saying that most men, even in a free country, are making these mistakes and are being ignorant. And because they are choosing to do so, they're not able to enjoy the finer fruits. He's not saying that they're not unavoidable. He's not saying that they are unavoidable. He's actually saying that they are avoidable and that they're just not doing a very good job of it. B, we'll come back to. C, only free countries can enjoy the finer fruits of life. He doesn't really say that either. He says even in this country, comparatively, even in this comparatively free country, they're not enjoying the fruits of life because of the ignorance and mistakes, which sort of implies that you don't need a free country to enjoy these finer fruits. So he's saying even in a free country, they're still not enjoying these fruits, which should imply that it's possible to enjoy the fruits of life in countries that aren't considered free comparatively. There's just nothing that's really supporting the fact that only free countries can enjoy the finer fruits of life. And I realize that a lot of the explanation for these questions is just that the passage doesn't support it. So if at any point you guys have a question or you think that you see something in the passage that does support another answer choice, you can put it in the chat, and myself and Janelle will be happy to explain it. But D, hard work prevents all enjoyment. That was another pretty popular one, but he's not really implying that hard work prevents all enjoyment. That's definitely the distractor, and that's definitely something that seems partially right. It's just that B is the better answer. The people in the country of discussion have a choice to enjoy the finer aspects of life, and it's pretty much just completely based on that first sentence. Basically what we just talked about before, through the mere ignorance and mistakes, they're so occupied with the factitious cares and superfluously coarse labors of life that its finer fruits cannot be plucked by them. So he's saying that they do have a chance to enjoy the finer aspects of life. They're not utilizing that choice. So why isn't it choice A? Yeah, choice A is a pretty extreme, it's pretty extreme statement. Ignorance and mistakes are unavoidable. So that's saying all ignorance, all mistakes are unavoidable. Humans are going to do it, which again, social science, humanities, they're gray areas, and ignorance and mistakes are not unavoidable. And there's nothing really in the passage that's supporting that the author believes that the mistakes are unavoidable. Does that make sense? I know this stuff can get kind of sticky.
Even when it says, which his growth requires, even still then.
Yeah, because which his growth requires, it's not really saying that ignorance and mistake are unavoidable. So when you pick an answer choice, like ignorance and mistakes are unavoidable, you should look through that passage and see, can I find concrete evidence that this is what the author thinks? Is the author implying that it's unavoidable? He's really not, because his point of writing, if ignorance and mistake were unavoidable, he wouldn't really have a point of writing this passage. Does that part make sense? That might be a better route to understanding, because he's talking about how ridiculous it is through ignorance and mistakes that we're working like machines and we're not able to enjoy the finer fruits. So if this path really were unavoidable, he wouldn't really have much of an argument to make the passage in the first place. Okay. Yep. Opal, always. We're always going to look for evidence to support the correct answer. Okay, so I want to be able to get to the other questions, so we are going to move on.
1 second before that. The last one, hard work prevents all enjoyment. Remember you told us that we want to get a general summary and not just, the question is about the first paragraph, not the entire passage. Is that why it was B and not D?
Yeah, so you should definitely always use information from the entire passage when you're thinking about it. And when I say that, I mean that it's asking you to look at the first paragraph. You should always use the information from the first paragraph, but you definitely want to use it in context with the rest of the passage. And also when you're looking at D, keep in mind, again, hard work prevents all enjoyment. That's a very extreme statement. So red flags should go off that is a distractor. Hard work prevents all enjoyment. It doesn't say that hard work prevents all enjoyment, but the coarse labors of life do prevent people, even in comparatively free countries, from enjoying finer fruits. It doesn't say, and it's also sort of the same thing with A, it doesn't say that they cannot enjoy enjoyment at all when they're working hard. There's nothing, that's basically what D is saying, and there's nothing in that first paragraph or even in the rest of the passage that's going to support that specific answer.
Okay. Okay.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question. I'll give you guys about another minute and 30 seconds, so take a look. I know these are hard, but you guys are doing very well. So keep it up, keep your focus. We're going to regroup in a couple minutes. Okay, I'll give you guys about 10 more seconds, get your final answers in. Looks like I lost some of you. Okay. And then we are going to end it. Okay. So nobody picked A. 45 picked B, 45% picked C, and 9% picked D. So the answer is in fact B. And let's take a look. So suppose an individual who owes a shoemaker money for shoes is currently reading the passage. The author would most likely respond by saying, so I would first read the answer choices and then go back to the passage and look for any sort of similarity in the passage to this question. So I would look anything regarding a shoemaker, regarding money, anything regarding the author talking directly to the person reading the passage. So that brings us to the second paragraph in the passage. So I just want to reread that really quickly. Some of you we all know are poor, find it hard to live, are sometimes, as it were, gasping for breath. I have no doubt that some of you who read this book are unable to pay for all the dinners which you have actually eaten, or for the coats and shoes which are fast wearing or are already worn out, and have come to this page to spend borrowed or stolen time robbing your creditors of an hour. So that is a pretty jarring statement. But yeah, from that alone, it made it pretty obvious to me that the answer was B. He really thinks that the individual should not be reading right now because he's pretty much saying you're reading this page on borrowed or stolen time, robbing your creditors of an hour. So he's saying you should be working and paying back your debts, but instead you're sitting here reading this passage. The individual has the right to read the passage. I'm interested as to why 45% of you chose that. So, I mean, if anybody's brave enough to type out their reasoning or explain their reasoning, we could definitely go over it. But there's just nothing really that's supporting that as well. The individual should finish reading the passage and then repay the shoemaker. Again, I would say maybe if there was something in the passage that was talking about maybe like the value of reading or how reading can help you work, then maybe C would be correct. But that's definitely a distractor, especially because it's an and statement and it's saying then repay the shoemaker. So it's talking about paying the shoemaker again. So that's definitely put there to grab your attention away from B. And D, the individual was robbed by the shoemaker. Again, there's not really anything that supports that in the passage. So I think this is a pretty good question to discuss. Does anybody have any questions about that? Because for this one specifically, I can definitely reason more so with why B is correct rather than why A, C, and D are incorrect, unless someone gives me that. But do you all understand why B is correct? Just because it's pretty much word for word, the second paragraph is basically where the answer is coming from. And I think this question, the really important part is how well and how quickly you are able to skim the passage for the answer. That's really what it comes down to. So, I mean, when you're reading your first time through, if you see like that forceful of a statement, I mean, he's telling you, the reader, that you're robbing your creditors. That's definitely a point of interest that you want to focus on because it's probably going to be a question. So that sort of intuitive things, you'll definitely develop those sort of senses as you read more. But that's really what it comes down to, is locating the information in the passage. Okay.
Chris, I hate to have, okay, so here's the thing. I'm getting these answers right, and it's just because of like something simple as sentence structure. So what I mean by that, subject, object, and whatever. So the question is asking about an individual, which is the subject. There's a shoemaker, which is the object, and the rest of it ends in passage.
Sure.
So these crazy stuff, and it works all the time. So I'm looking for an answer that has individual as a subject, which is B, and then the next thing should be coming up is the shoemaker, which is it's B again, and it ends in passage. So we have the subject, object, and I forgot what the last one is when you're doing sentence structure. None of these answer choices has subject as individual, the object as shoemaker. Am I just over, because I learned this way back when you were in high school.
Right. So that's a very interesting way.
So and it's working. I'm like, so how comfortable should I be with unorthodox answers that are, it's scaring me. Getting these right just because of these, like it goes back to your question number, your introduction that says, if it doesn't answer the question, that's not your answer. And again, the answer has the subject object, and I forgot what that third variable is. If back when you learned.
Right. I mean, that it's definitely something, if you're getting the right answer for it, it's definitely something you can keep in your back pocket. You should always look at the content of the question first, because that's what's really going to answer the question. But if you don't know where to go, and you have some other method like that, like, comparing.
Yeah, and the only reason why I use that method is because I'm never finishing passage. So I know you said for us to go back. So if I'm running out of time, I do not have time to go back to see where this shoemaker, because then I'm just going to overanalyze. And so I just do the subject, object, and whatever that third. It's back in high school when you were learning about sentence structure. So, and that's the only answer choice that had the subject, object, and then the passage in that particular order.
Right.
Every time.
I mean, it's definitely an interesting method. I can't say whether or not that would pan out with every answer, but I mean, like I said, if you're running out of time, if you think that you can't you just physically do not have the time to do that, then you kind of just have to pull out all the stops. If that's something that's been working for you, then
But
go for it.
don't make it because like I said, I'm not comfortable with it, but I was
Yeah.
and I was just like, okay, time to just construct, look at the construct.
Right. I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't use it as your first plan. I would definitely try to use more of the techniques that we've been discussing today. Try to make it very evidence and content based, but I would definitely keep it in the back pocket if all else fails.
Okay.
Okay, because you can't lose points for taking a guess on this on the MCAT. So, at the very least, try something, take an educated guess. All right, so question 3. I will open the poll. I'll give you guys about 1:30, and we will regroup and discuss after. All right, I guess you guys did see that. Take about 15 more seconds and we will discuss. Okay. All right. So 9% said A, 9% said B, 82% said C, and nobody said D. So yes, the correct answer is C. So the author mentions Hippocrates in the final paragraph in order to A, serve as an example for human shortcomings. I wouldn't really say that. I'm just going to reread the passage quickly. The whole ground of human life seems to some to have been gone over by their predecessors, both the heights and the valleys, and all things to have been cared for. According to Evelyn, the wise Solomon prescribed ordinances for the very distance of trees, and the Romans have decided how often you may go into your neighbor's land to gather the acorns which fall on it without trespass, and what shares belongs to that neighbor. Hippocrates has even left directions how we should cut our nails, that is, even with the ends of our fingers, neither shorter nor longer. Undoubtedly, the very tedium and ennui which presume to have exhausted the variety and the joys of life are as old as Adam, but man's capacity has never been measured, nor are we to judge of what he can do by any precedence, so little has been tried. Whatever have been thy failures hitherto, be not afflicted, my child, for who shall assign to thee what thou hast left undone? So A, serve as an example for human shortcomings. The passage really the paragraph, really as a whole is just pretty much defined by that first statement. The whole ground of human life seems to some to have been gone over by their predecessors. So this paragraph really is talking about instructions and how predecessors have set precedents for people. So it's not really talking about the human shortcomings. Providing concrete instructions for self-care is probably the distractor of the bunch. Because Hippocrates is talking about leaving directions of how we cut our nails, which is self-care, but that's not really what that's not really why the author mentions Hippocrates in terms of the context of the last paragraph. So most of you did pick C, give an example of the wide range of instructions left by predecessors. That really is the best answer because most of the paragraph is just listing the different types of instructions that were left by predecessors, by the ancestors. So we're seeing Solomon prescribed ordinances for the distance of trees. The Romans decided how often you can go to your neighbor's land to gather acorns. And they're saying even Hippocrates left directions of how to cut your nails. So you can sense the author's tone. He says Hippocrates has even left directions on how we should cut out. So they're trying to emphasize the wide range of instructions that are left by predecessors. And D, contradicting Evelyn's statement. It doesn't really contradict Evelyn's statement. She talks about Solomon and his ordinance regarding the distance of trees, and Hippocrates is just talking about trimming his nails. So the two concepts really have nothing to do with each other, so they're not really contradicting. But definitely C, just because the purpose of the passage is C. It's because they're giving you a bunch of examples of the instructions that were left by predecessors. Do we understand that one? You guys seem to do pretty well on that one. Hopefully because you understood it and not because I have butterfingers. Anyway, anyone have any questions about these? Okay. So that's really all of the content that I have for tonight. Just some parting thoughts for you guys. Make a plan, map out your study time, make room for diagnostic full lengths, utilize online sources. If you're going to study for the MCAT, you have to make a plan. You have to make time for it and you have to make a plan. So Keith said, can you explain C again? Sure, we can go back for a minute. So C, give an example of the wide range of instructions left by predecessors. So if you go back to the passage, that's what the passage is explaining, especially if you hone in on where it says Hippocrates. Hippocrates has even left directions on how we should cut our nails. So if you compare that to the previous couple of sentences, they're just listing different instructions that the predecessors have given. Does that make sense, Keith?
Yeah, a little bit. I guess I think the one where I used was I saw some other people and they were saying stuff that they kind of like left, and I was just thinking, okay, that's kind of like why I chose C. It was more of a kind of a hunch feeling.
Right.
More than anything. I don't know.
You know,
I didn't really have a
yeah, after you read these questions a while, you're going to have a hunch for certain answers. You just have to sort of analyze that hunch. So if your intuition is telling you that C is the right answer, lean into it, look into it and observe it. It's a good point, like a good jumping point. So yeah, you definitely want to listen to your intuition. Do you think KA Carr's passages help? I am not familiar with what KA is.
I think it's Khan Academy.
Khan Academy. So I don't have a lot of experience with Khan Academy studying for the MCAT. I have heard, are not the best representing MCU on cars. Right. So I'm going to agree with Janelle on that one. I've also heard Khan Academy, I'm pretty sure that they're currently, they're trying to revamp their MCAT program and they're like pouring money into it. But I really did not use Khan Academy for my MCAT prep. The only times that I really touched upon Khan Academy were for psychology and sociology, because I think they can do a pretty good job of explaining just, raw content for psych and sociology. In terms of the more analytical subjects like cars, I would say maybe not the best. Yeah, Jack Weston, right, like Janelle said, is definitely a better free resource, I would say. Okay, and be prepared. Give yourself enough time to familiarize yourself with the pace of the car section. So, if your MCAT's coming up in a couple of months and you haven't started timing yourself on these car sections, I would definitely recommend that you start doing it, because answering these questions without a time constraint and answering them with two totally different ball games. So you really don't want to blindside yourself, and you want to give yourself enough time to adjust to the actual pace and build your stamina, like months. And finally, breathe. Stress management is key. That's pretty self-explanatory. You have to go in with the right mindset. You have to be able to compartmentalize your stresses. One section ends, the section is over, you move on to the next section. And just be prepared, and you'll be able to manage your stress pretty wisely.
How many passages do you suggest for us to do each day if like our MCAT is like 6 months from now or like 9 months from now?
So I personally, the way I studied, I used an adaptive Q bank. So I would usually do like 2 to 3 passages if I was that far out, and then maybe a couple of months beforehand, like maybe 3 or 4 months, I would start adding the time constraints. And I would say no later than like two months before. You should start doing full length, 9 passages, 53 questions in 90 minutes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.